Good evening, Juliana.
Hi, Trevor.
Nice to see you, and good evening, everybody. My name is Trevor White, and I am the director of the Little Museum of Dublin. And it is my pleasure to be hosting or co-hosting with Major, my cat, this evening's edition of Santa Rita 120 Dublin Stories. This series is produced with the support of our patrons in Dublin City Council and the Department of Culture. And we are thrilled to welcome you along this evening. Maybe you will have a glass of Santa Rita at your side if you don't have a cat or a dog. I dare say my cat will disappear in record time. Anyway, our guest this evening is Juliana Adelman, and Juliana is the Assistant Professor of History at Dublin City University. And in a previous life as a my cat has now disappeared again. In a previous life as a biology student, Juliana was interested in bacterial pathogenesis, which sounds highly contagious. Happily, however, her current research focus is the history of Ireland and Britain during the 19th century. And this evening, we're going to talk about Juliana's new book, and indeed to launch her new book, Civilised by Beasts, Animals and Urban Change in 19th Century Dublin. And here is a copy of this wonderful book. So Juliana, you're very welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Trevor. Your cat is much more cooperative than mine. She's perched in the corner of the room. She'll come over and knock over something, I imagine, at some stage. But
dear, oh dear. I would encourage people who are watching us, who are joining us this evening, to ask questions in the chat. And I'm happy to say that we will give a copy of Juliana's book away to the person who asks not the brainiest question, but the best question, and that as defined by us in a completely arbitrary fashion. It may include a good pun. I always like a good pun. But to start, we will of course try to answer your questions, or rather Juliana will try to answer your questions as well during the session. Maybe just start, Juliana, by telling us a little bit about the genesis of this book, and what was it that brought you to the subject?
Yeah, well, actually, I started off as a historian of science, I suppose, converting from my experience as a scientist. So I was originally interested in the history of zoology. So I had this idea of doing something on the history of the zoo, because Dublin Zoo is a very early zoo in terms, especially in terms of public zoos. So it's actually opened in 1831. The Zoological Society is founded in 1830. And so that's where I started. And then I just started getting much more interested in all the other animals that I kept encountering in records of the history of the city. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of shifted. I started reading a lot of environmental history, and the focus just kind of moved away from the exotic creatures that were so interesting to me initially to all the other animals that were much more numerous in the city. So that's kind of the basic genesis. I suppose this is my brief opportunity that I should say a little bit of thanks, in that this is a very long ongoing project, which started off as a research council, Irish Research Council postdoc with David Dixon, and which a lot of people have listened to me talk about for a long time. I won't make a list of thanks, but you know who you are. And it started off as a project about the zoo, and it ended up as something quite different.
So the book itself is, frankly, the scope is dazzling. I finished reading it at 1:45 this morning, and I had no idea, frankly, at the start of this week that I would find myself so engrossed in this subject. But what I love about it is that you use animal life in the city as a prism through which to document not simply urban change, but public health, transportation, policing, class, nationalism. What was it? When did you first realize that the subject itself was this amazing, that it offered this extraordinary opportunity to tell us so much about Victorian Dublin?
I suppose that every time I looked at a new animal or a new problem that had to do with animals, it seemed to open up another corner of life in the city. And there are other historians who've looked at cities through the prism of animals. There's a really great book on Seattle by Frederick Brown, and so I had a sense that it had this promise, but I think I hadn't realized. I mean, the number of chapters I could have written on other animals that I didn't even make it into the book, because they are so important to how the city is shaped in the 19th century. And I think partly because they're so relied upon just in an economic sense, and it's amazing to me now that anyone would write a history of the city without paying any attention to these animals, because they are, simply just an absolutely integral part of making the city function on a day-to-day basis during the 19th century. So yeah, they just offer so many opportunities, as you say, to look at issues like class. Of course, depending on your social status, you had different interactions with animals. You may be relied upon them for work or for income. You might have had dirtier, animal filth surrounding where you lived, or maybe you had the opportunity not to have that. And so there, and you either relied upon them as transportation in ways that somebody else took care of, or you were dependent upon them for your income from providing transportation. So they really do open up a lot of those debates. And then of course people love, that great saying, animals are good to think with. People love to talk about things by using animals in political cartoons, or using animals to compare people to say something about them. So they really are, once you started looking, they are just everywhere.
You're very generous about the work of other historians, people, of course, including David Dixon, whose magisterial biography of Dublin is I think we're all kind of working in David's shadow. But one of the trends that you kind of reflect on is the ways in which animals themselves, that animal history has changed, and the way that it's told. And maybe you'd reflect on that for a moment, please.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what historians are trying to explore now, who are interested in animals, and it's not just historians, but other people interested in animals in other humanities areas, is kind of how do we think about animals and try and kind of come out of our fully human perspective, because partly driven just by environmentalism and trying to think about our role in the world. And I suppose the historian that I started with is Keith Thomas, who wrote a book called Man in the Natural World quite a long time ago now, where he comes up with this idea of the human dilemma, where he sees the problem of modernity, as he puts it in England, as being this sudden awareness that maybe humans are not just entitled to use animals, exploit them in any way that they want, and the problems that this creates for people in terms of trying to justify and deal with the world around them, which is entirely dependent on exploiting animals. And I kind of really liked this idea, which is used in Susan Nance and other historians' work as well. But I suppose he talks a lot about kind of, I don't know, I guess, philosophical ideas about animals, about natural history, and about changes in science and literature. And whereas when I looked at how that kind of human dilemma gets negotiated in the city, it has a lot more to do with public health and order and class and kind of visions of what a city is supposed to be like. And I suppose most of us would be surprised if a city had as many animals as it did in the 19th century. Now we just don't think of a city as being a space for animal life, but really that's such a new thing. And I guess that's, so that's, I think what historians that are interested in kind of bringing animals back into history are encouraging people to think about the way in which organisms other than humans, and you could spread this a lot wider as an environmental historian, not just organisms, but even, rivers and seas, how those things are acting as, at the very least, as constraints on what you can do with a space, how you can change the city. And, you know, I think I say in my book, a city that needs to eat meat has to be a different city than a city that doesn't want to eat meat. You know, it's reliant, if the food is not being, you know, if the cattle are not in the city, well, it's then reliant on networks outside of the city. So all those kind of ways in which we make invisible the things that we rely on are, I think, things that historians looking at animals are really interested in kind of unearthing again and encouraging people to think a little more about.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating that. When is he writing, incidentally, that man, Keith Thomas? Is he?
Oh, like 1980s, 1970s, yeah.
Because in a way, that concern that he captures there, that tension, I suppose, between our determination to exploit animals on the one hand and our determination to kind of do something about it on the other, that guilt, I suppose, is itself, it's a very Victorian ideal, isn't it? It's something, again, that you tease out brilliantly in the book. And, you know, time and again, you kind of realize that animal life used to be a lot more public and it became more private. And it was largely a function of the kind of zeal of the Victorian improvers, you know, typically middle-class busybodies, to, you know, put it bluntly.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. I mean, I think that trying to make it invisible is really one of the main kind of driving forces behind a lot of the reforms, especially the ones that have to do with food animals. So, you know, the idea of making, you know, putting abattoirs and you know, cattle markets and all of that kind of outside the boundaries of the city, so that we don't have to see it. It doesn't pollute the streets, and it's not too intermingled with everyday human life. And that's something that historians have really begun to unpack. And the slaughterhouse is a particularly good example, because people are really concerned about what it does to you to see that, not just to smell it and to experience it, but also just to see, you know, creatures being slaughtered. I note there's a question there. Somebody wants to know the name of Keith Thomas's book, which is called Man and the Natural World. I think in England, I think it might be 1500 to 1800. I'm pretty sure it's on the shelf behind me, if that's not enough information to go by. And the Zoological Society is founded in 1830. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's that eagerness to hide things and to kind of push them to the edge. So I mean, people who are familiar with the north side of Dublin will know where the cattle market was, and the abattoir where they tried to push all of the meat slaughtering to the abattoir was just over the city line, as it was on the other side of the North Circular Road. There was actually a tunnel between the market and the abattoir, and both of them are now public housing because they were obviously corporation owned property. So.
I want to return to the cattle market, because again, it's a wonderful way of looking at the bigger story. It tells us so much about the developments of Dublin. But just another, one piece of housekeeping as well is some of you may have your badges. I neglected to put mine on, so I'm going to put mine on now. I wear it with great pride. I know you're wearing yours.
I was told I needed to wear something that wasn't black, so that it's obscured my badge slightly.
Yes, well, I commend you for an absolutely very simple but ingenious device for promoting your book. Well done, Juliana. And speaking of that, in fact, maybe you'd unpack another phrase for civilized by beasts. Maybe just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I have to. So this was in a speech by Whitley Stokes, who was a kind of definitely one of these Victorian busybodies and also a medical man. And he was involved in the foundation of the Zoological Society. And he makes this speech about why we need a zoological society. And one of his arguments is that we owe it to the beasts to civilize them back, because they have civilized us. And his suggestion was that we've been civilized by beasts because in order to avoid, you know, the predations of wild animals, men built cities. Humans retreated into cities and built walls. And actually, it was a friend of mine, Owen O'Mahony, who I think is here this evening, who read a lot of early versions of particular chapters of the book. And I remember we had a meeting just to chat about our writing. And he said, well, there's the title of your book. And I thought, oh yeah, that's a good title. So yeah, so that was, I think I liked the phrase because it brought a lot of those ideas to the fore about, you know, trying to make the city civilized, and what did that mean, and this kind of idea of trying to separate nature and culture and to set up those boundaries between human and animal. So that's the origin of the title. You're very civilized, Kitty is.
That is brilliant, thank you. Just returning to this idea of I suppose class and nationalism, maybe you tell us a little bit about the contrasting fortunes of the zoo on the one hand and the DSPCA on the other hand, and maybe just what, as you do so, you might answer, somebody had asked us in relation to the Zoological Society about the genesis of that as well, please.
Yeah, so the Zoological Society is first founded in 1830, and then they opened the gardens sort of about 6 months after, I think, they're founded. And it was really it was a post-Catholic emancipation kind of project. It was like a reconciliation project. And I think these were like voluntary associations like the Zoological Society are really popular in the 19th century, and there's loads of them devoted to different kind of branches of science and music and literature. And the Zoological Society is really advertised as a kind of, you know, a kind of, let's bring the elite back together after this rift between us over the passage of Catholic emancipation. So it has a kind of political or subverting politics kind of goal from the outset, whereas the DSPCA, and it's the Zoological Society is, you know, very much trying to copy the Zoological Society in London, which is also an early zoological society in gardens. I suppose the DSPCA in a really similar way is also copying a London society. It's trying to be a branch of a society that's been founded in London. But whereas the SPCA in London is very much associated with reform politics and, you know, certain kinds of you know, high profile politicians and things back that. In Dublin, that just doesn't happen. And so whereas one kind of good way to see the contrast between them is, I don't know if he ever goes, but Daniel O'Connell joined the Zoological Society as a, you know, as a member to go to the gardens. He never had anything to do with the DSPCA. And I think the DSPCA just looks to people like, you know, how can you be advocating for people to be nicer to animals when you aren't going to take care of the problems of poverty, and you're going to pass legislation that's cruel to human Irish beings, as opposed to, you know, who cares if people are beating their cattle when people are starving in parts of the country. So it could not attract, in its early days anyway, it just could not attract the same political support. And even, you know, Philip Crampton, another medical man who's very involved in the Zoological Society and is involved in a lot of reforming things in the city and is quite a prominent public figure. He had nothing to do with the SPCA, and he seems like a very natural fit. He makes a speech against vivisection, but he doesn't have anything to do with it. And I just think it has this kind of political taint of looking a little bit too much like you prefer animals to your fellow humans. And so it just really doesn't catch on until much later in the century.
It's kind of ironic though as well, isn't it? When you think that, as you say, you know, the zoo itself it's a very conservative institution, and that yet it really captures the public imagination in a way that's, I mean, it's extraordinary, the numbers that you cite, that it's basically on Sundays, I think, isn't it? It's much cheaper to get in on a Sunday, and as such, it's, you know, it's thronged on a Sunday, but the swells come along on a Sunday to keep an eye on the working classes as well. You know, that's a subject of fascination for them. And then they throw it open, I think, one day, don't they? Is it for Queen Victoria's coronation?
Occasionally, for the coronation, they have a big open day. And
20,000 people, I think, or something.
Huge
come on a single day. I read that with great envy.
Yeah. Well, someday the museum, you'd have to be, you know, in a continuous stream to get in and out of the building, 20,000 people in one day. Yeah, it just has an immediate impact as an attraction, and in a way that you know, and the DSPCA has no attraction to offer. Essentially, they're roaming around the streets, you know, telling people to stop beating animals and getting them arrested. So it doesn't have the same, appeal, I suppose, which is understandable. Someone's asked if there's an audiobook. There is not, as far as I know, as yet.
There should be. There should be, and I have to say this, and I'm sorry to say this. I really want this book to be published as a paperback, because I think it needs to be. It'll be hugely popular, and I mean, obviously, it will appeal to an academic audience, and it deserves that you know, that sort of scrutiny among your peers. But I'd love to see it. You know, reach a really large audience, because it's, as I say, it's a fascinating prism through which to tell the story of Dublin. And there's a question, which is a very brainy question, but I can hardly even read it, it's so brainy, from Christina Decker. I know you mentioned class. Interactions with animals and animal ownership are sometimes portrayed in gendered ways. For example, Lady Bertram and her pug in Mansfield Park, the idea of spinsters and their cats. Have you come across this in your research? Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting one. It isn't a huge focus of the book, but there are definite echoes of that. One of them that comes to mind is the story that kind of eventually causes there to be a dog pound, effectively, where they round up dogs in an effort to deal with rabies. And that is that a woman who was called Anna Maria Collins gets her little dog strays, and when it comes back, it bites her, and she gets rabies and she dies, and she's only 25, I think. And it sets off this really interesting debate between those people who are immediately for doing something about rabid dogs. We must do something. We need to introduce regulations. We need to round dogs up off the street and kill them. And then other people who are so disgusted by the habit of keeping dogs as pets, and start writing into the newspapers saying things like, you know, just these women and their filthy brutes, they shouldn't be allowed to bring them on trains. They shouldn't. And there's a whole kind of,
that's the lapdog, isn't it?
Yes, there's a whole kind of realm of poetry about women and their pets. Some of it celebratory and some of it very demeaning. And there's a woman involved in the early DSPCA who also gets a lot of stick in the newspapers. They say something like, you know, she can't lay her head down on her pillow without weeping at the thought of a lacerated donkey. So there is definitely a gendered angle to a lot of the stories. Yeah.
Thank you. Another equally brainy question from Vincent Kenny. Vincent asks, he prefaces it by saying, this is not meant to be a trick question. Why are cats considered less dangerous in the transmission of toxocariasis, whereas dogs get all the blame? I probably mispronounced that.
Yeah,
I apologize.
I should have to defer that question to a scientist. But I think there is, I think that a cat is a kind of, definitely people perceive cats differently than dogs. I didn't really look at cats in my book, although as a lot of people familiar with Dublin will know, there was a home for rescue cats towards the end of the century. But I don't know why cats are blamed for, or dogs are rather blamed for disease where cats are not. But that'd be an interesting study in its own right, I think.
And then Vincent asks a question for which really is a trick question. He says, how can we ever rescue Schrodinger's cat from its terrible dilemma of being both alive and dead?
Open the box.
Open the box. Okay, thank you. Good. I want to go on now to talk a little bit about Mr. Alexis Soyer. This celebrity chef who comes to France to Dublin during the famine, and sets up a sort of a soup kitchen. And I had always assumed that, you know, that he'd been given this very warm welcome, and, you know, we were very grateful to him. But it turns out quite the opposite, in fact. Maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So in one of the chapters looks at the famine, and one of the things that it talks about is just the way that people saw what you ate as kind of indication of your status as civilized or not. And so Soyer, for those who don't know, was a French chef. He was a chef at the Reform Club in London, and he came over to set up these big kind of scientific famine soup kitchens. So they were to produce gallons and gallons of soup really efficiently. And he does two things that are very controversial. One is he makes a soup that has almost no meat in it. So it doesn't use bones as part of the broth. It's largely vegetable scraps, a lot of salt, a lot of sugar, small amount of grain, and a very, very small amount of meat. And people see this as kind of not food for people. You know, it's not a hearty soup. It's not the right kind of nutrition for humans. It's kind of like scraps you would give to an animal. And then he also does this other thing because he's keen to show off his fancy kitchen. And he, the kitchen initially offers people to pay and come and watch as people are fed. And this is seen as kind of like the same as charging people to look at the carnivores in the zoo. And so it's sort of both of those things look like demeaning to the human poor who it's supposed to serve. And yeah, I mean, you can be not surprised that the proprietor of Johnson's Beef a la Mode House or whatever has his major objections to the soup, but it wasn't just, you know, purveyors of beef who thought it was objectionable, but other, you know, even chemists who thought they knew, you know, what was exactly the right thing for humans to eat. They didn't think that this was sufficiently nutritious. So
just to be clear, again, it's kind of like that thing in the zoo, you know, where the swells come on the Sunday to look at everyone else. People actually paid to get a seat in the soup kitchen, not to eat the soup, but to look at the other people.
Yeah, I mean, I don't actually know whether they were seated or standing now, in fairness, but yes, I mean, the idea was you paid to go and see how the thing was, the opening event, to see how the thing was functioning. But yeah, I think they got quite a bit of backlash for that.
I'm very happy to hear it. Yeah, the mind boggles. So Dublin, and maybe just talk a little bit about cattle as well, because again, there's a fascinating chapter about the cattle market. And of course, a lot of Dubliners, older Dubliners, will remember the sight of cattle being marched through the city, typically en route to the port, where they kind of ended up on English dinner plates, really, didn't it? And of course, the legacy of that tradition is all around us in names like Bull Alley and Cow's Lane. You might just give us a kind of a sort of a potted history of cattle and the development of Dublin, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there had been a cattle market in Dublin for centuries, as there would have been in most cities. And I suppose, and that had traditionally been on the north side of the city, initially in Smithfield. And there's a good reason for that, because it's where droving roads converge. So it's a good place to bring your cattle if you're bringing them from fields and from adjacent territories where they were grazed and fattened. So Dublin is traditionally a fat cattle market as opposed to a store cattle. The store cattle tend to go a different route and they get fattened over in England. And what happens during the 19th century, the reason people still know and remember cattle walking down the street is really because of a decision that's taken in the 19th century, where some people want to move the cattle market to the port, and they want to move it to the port so that the cattle don't come through the city, so that they come on the train, they end up in the port in what they're, you know, they like talking about it as though it's going to be sort of look like a giant railway station, except it's a railway station only for cattle. They arrive from the train, they get on the boat, and they go to England. Except that the drovers and the graziers and all the traditional market men and cattle dealers, they don't want this because it's total disruption to their business. And it's away from, there's no fields down by the port. So you've got animals that are coming that won't have been fed or watered, that will just be sitting and being fed in stalls again before they're moved on. And so in the end, the corporation makes a new cattle market, which is just up the road from the old cattle market. And so that meant that the cattle had to continue to be driven through town on their way to the ships. And it's amazing how much of Dublin's businesses are dependent on this cattle trade. I mean, the cattle trade is enormous. It's just one of the most financially lucrative businesses you could be in. It's really important for the shape of the city. It's really important for that area of the city, Aaron Key Ward, who lives there, what kind of jobs they have. And it's just, I mean, you couldn't overstate the influence of the cattle market, particularly during the 19th century. It's why the abattoir ends up where it does, you know, right across the road from the cattle market. And a lot of the kind of wealthy people who are influential have some stake in cattle business, be it as a butcher or as a dealer or grazier. Yeah. So
is it one of the largest in Europe?
Yeah.
Is that right?
For a period of time, it is one of the largest, if not the largest, in Europe. And yeah, I mean, and most of that is export trade. And of course it's serving the city as well. I mean, that's where, if you're a butcher, you go there and buy your cattle to sell, to slaughter and to turn into meat for your shop.
And it continues long into the 20th century, but at a much lower level, though. Am I right?
Well, it takes quite a while before it's at a lower level. It's really, as far as I understand, it's really the marts that kind of they just end up being more convenient for farmers in the end. And so the cattle market kind of goes into decline in the kind of, I think, 1940s and 50s, and then it just doesn't recover. And so I think it's 73, I think, that is closed.
71, I think I remember from Hazy, 1 a.m.
And the
You're probably right.
No, I don't know. The abattoir follows shortly after. Yeah.
I think another thing you bring out brilliantly in the book is the smells of that, you know, the sights, the sounds, the smells of the cattle being marched along the North Circular Road to the ports. And, you know, that's a huge part of the life of the city for so many years. Is it on a Thursday morning? Is it?
Yeah. So the market is on the Thursday morning, and by the afternoon, everything is sort of has gone its various ways. And the amount of waste produced and the noise and the, you know, drovers. I mean, they're getting, for some of the drovers, that would be their one bit of work. Some of them went on the boats and they would take the cattle on to their next destination as well. And it becomes a real issue when there's an outbreak of disease in England amongst cattle, the cattle plague. And they have to start, it's the sort of some of the same things that you later see with foot and mouth. In effect, they're trying to disinfect people as they're, bringing cattle, because the cattle are all going one way. But the concern is that if any disease comes back, then they're absolutely scuppered. So, so a lot of the drovers are then subject to, like, essentially disinfection of their clothes and all kinds of things on the journey. I can see questions.
Juliana, I have been hogging you, for which I apologize. We have much better questions from our audience, so I'm going to defer to them. Bert Adelman, who is no doubt related to you.
That might be my dad, yeah.
Might be your dad. Asked, was there a kosher butcher in Victorian Dublin?
And there was. I didn't write anything about it. The kosher butchers are kind of interesting because there's a fascination with, there's a suggestion that they're less clean than the regular butchers, which is obviously partly rooted in prejudice. But that's another story I don't know very much about, but there was definitely.
But presumably on Clanbrassil Street or there.
Yeah, around would have been where there were a few Jews living later in the 19th century. Yeah.
Yeah. Sinead asks, if you had to choose to be one animal from the book, what animal would it be and why? Very good question, Sinead.
Definitely would not be any of the animals in the zoo, because it's not a good time to be a zoo animal. They don't have a happy life.
I was shocked by that, actually. You might just tell us a little bit about this, hiring the rhinoceros for £200 or a month or something.
The animals live a very short time in the zoo. A lot of the monkeys get tuberculosis, just like humans. And even some of the kind of four-legged creatures get tuberculosis, and the zoo just expects them to die. It pretty much assumes it can't make them live for very long periods of time. So it wouldn't be any of them. And they hire animals on short-term contracts that are, essentially going to be really attract a lot of pennies. They're going to get a lot of people to come to the zoo. So who would I be? I think I would be a dog in some rich person's house, because if you were a wealthy person and you loved your dog, the dog had a pretty good life, and there was no kibble, so they got steak and good food from the table. So I think that's my pick.
Sarah asks, why do you think it's possible for people who are supposedly very empathic in their care for animals to detach so much from social problems?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I don't, if I stick to the 19th century, I mean, there's definitely an issue where some people are almost more disgusted by human misery than they are by the misery of animals. And I think they feel that humans have choices and can avoid misery and avoid temptation. They can avoid drink, and they can choose not to be violent, and they're supposed to have controls over their emotions and their behavior. Whereas there is a feeling, right or wrong, probably wrong, that animals don't have control over their emotions, and we've been given stewardship of them because it says in the Bible, and therefore it reflects badly on us and our humanity if we treat them badly. But I mean, that's not because, I mean, a lot of people were aware that this was not maybe exactly what the interpretation the Bible had intended. And there was a lot of pushback from across the political and the religious spectrum on the idea of being more kind to animals than you were to people. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but I think there is something about the idea that humans have a control over themselves that we perceive animals as not having, and therefore it's our duty to behave better.
Claudia Kinmonth asks, when did authorities begin to try to prevent people from cohabiting with the pigs they were rearing?
Well, in terms of the 19th century, from the very start. But I suppose they don't have any real regulations to do anything about it until about 1849, when they have the Nuisances Removal Acts, 1848, 1849. And then they start essentially turning up at people's houses and inspecting. If a neighbor complains, though, so it usually has to be instigated by a complaint, and then they start getting more police officers involved in essentially strolling around the cities looking for things to complain about. And then by the end of the century, they've got a kind of group of medical officers of health, one of whom, their job is to deal with disease and to also work in dispensaries, and they provide medical care. But one of the things they're asked to do is also to report on nuisances. And so a pig in a house was a nuisance. It was considered a risk to everyone's health. And so they might have reported on that. Although in reality, it's usually neighbors and it's usually police officers.
Yeah, I was fascinated by your account of the Dublin Metropolitan Police doing their annual walkabout survey of the animals of the city. And it did strike me that pigs are kind of victimized, really, aren't they? There's a kind of I felt a bit sorry for them.
I think
maybe it's just me.
Yeah, no, they definitely are seen as a particularly dirty animal. There's a long-standing, prejudice against the pig as a particularly dirty animal. People think that pig manure smells worse than horse manure, and so they are targeted for elimination. And I think it's partly also just this thing that Claudia asked. It's this association with the poor, with keeping one pig in your house in conditions that people don't consider hygienic or ideal, too close to the house or inside the house, not cleaning out the waste quickly enough. And they're kind of easy pickings as opposed to a big business with a,
Again, you go back to that kind of strand, though, don't you? That kind of sort of slightly patronizing, paternalistic, Victorian thing of we know best, we know what's best for you. That sort of comes through in a lot of the, particularly these middle class attitudes towards animals throughout the city. Rob Jackson asks a fun question. If you could go back to Dublin at any point in the history that you describe, when would you pick?
Ooh, I think it should be if you had to, because I like reading about it, but I'm not sure I would have liked to live in the city at that stage. Too many diseases. Even though I probably would not have approved of how they were keeping the animals, I like the idea of going on Queen Victoria's coronation to the zoo to see what it would have been like with 20,000 people from all across Dublin, wandering around the animals. So that'd be my pick.
Thank you very much. And incidentally, on the subject of Queen Victoria, I was immensely fascinated to learn about this firm of coachmakers, the Huttons, who built the state coach for Queen Victoria that is still in use by the royal family today from Dublin.
Yeah, apparently, yes. Hutton was, they then turned into, I believe they made automobiles. That they were on Summer Hill, or what's now Summer Hill. That area had a lot of coach makers, and Dublin had a huge number of coach makers because there are just lots of carriages in the city. I mean, a lot of people remark that it's such an important way of showing your status, and people are so anxious about their status that there are more carriages in Dublin, according to people at the time. And there are more, there do seem to be, in terms of what we would expect from population numbers, more carriages, more coachmen, more places that make them more whip makers. You know, there is a kind of higher proportion of people employed in that sector.
I wonder, are they the same people who made that very grand carriage for Daniel O'Connell in 1841 when he's Lord Mayor, which is still in use today? I dare say one of our brainy audience members.
I should know that. Maybe somebody else does
answer that question. Amy Namuraku asks, when I'm reading about history, I often daydream about alternative realities that may have come to be. Based on your research, do you have an alternative vision of modern day Dublin for animals that might have happened if things had gone differently in the past?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. You're gonna have a tough job picking one, especially if we don't get to the rest of the question. Okay, let's see. If I had an alternative vision, yeah, I mean, I think it would have been interesting to see what might have happened if some people had their way and had decided there was a big push to kind of turn Dublin into a meat producing rather than a cattle producing city. So the idea being that it would export meat, chilled meat, instead of exporting live animals. And I think if that had happened, I don't know if it would have been a better reality, but it would have changed a lot of things. It would have changed the city very dramatically. It would have changed the countryside. It might have changed the whole system of cattle farming because it would have required a different, different approach to moving animals around, a different system of processing things. And the idea was that you send your steaks and your filet mignon to England, but you keep the byproducts locally, and so that poor people have access to those byproducts. Because what was happening instead was they were all going with the cattle as well, right? So you're not keeping anything that local people can afford. So it would have been interesting to see what the ramifications of that would have been, but it doesn't happen.
Good answer. Can you tell us a little bit about the Smithfield Horse Fair? Says Carol Quinn, and she asked specifically, did people see it as a vibrant marketplace or as something bringing dirt and disease to the city?
So the horse fair is actually a relatively new thing, and it starts at the end of the 19th century, and then it's not very consistent for quite a while. And the reason that it starts is it's a sop to the people who live around Smithfield who have lost the markets. And so the idea is that the horses are clean, so we can have a horse market. We can't have a pig market and we can't have a cattle market in this crowded area, but we could have a horse market. And then that will bring some kind of business back to the area that's been taken away by taking away the other animals. So I can't remember when the first one is off the top of my head, but it's close to the end of the 19th century. It isn't, and then, like I said, it takes a while for it to become a kind of regular occurrence that as we know it now.
And today we misperceive it as something that has its roots in medieval Dublin. You know, you often hear that said about it, but
well, I suppose Smithfield as a market is a medieval, you know, and I presume there were always a variety of animals sold at the market, but the horse market specifically, using Smithfield as a place to sell horses and only horses, is an invention of the late 19th, early 20th century.
Fascinating, thank you. Liam Maloney asks, thinking of Charles Cameron, health inspections, and people like city engineer Park Neville, can you discuss animals and public health as you found in your research?
Yeah, I mean,
he says, sorry, I beg your pardon. He says, I'll park my question there.
Okay.
Boom, boom.
Well, they're intimately linked, animals and public health. And Cameron, you know, one of the things he spends an enormous amount of his time doing is inspecting meat for evidence of disease and trying to get meat thrown away or given to the carnivores in the zoological gardens. So a huge number of the pressing public health issues are to do with animals. Even the sewers, which we think of as a human waste problem, one of the problems for the sewers is that they're getting loads of other waste, including animal waste, including manure and hay, and all those things are actually really dense and cause a huge amount of problems, you know, flushing drains and things like that. So they are, you know, probably one of the slaughterhouses, dairy yards where they start seeing the transfer of disease through milk, and also the transfer of cattle diseases to, you know, to people who are either working with the cattle or through their, again, meat and milk, tuberculosis through meat and milk. I mean, animals are just central to all the public health questions really of that period.
It's something that you tease out brilliantly in the book, and yet another reason for you all to go and buy it. Liam, incidentally, has another reading recommendation, L. Clare, The Dublin Cattle Market in the Dublin Historical Record, which is in the notes here as well. Patrick asks, he says he's looking forward to the book, and this may be beyond the scope, but he's curious, does vegetarianism emerge as a phenomenon in 19th century Dublin, and is concern for animal welfare a motivation?
Yes, and yes, it's not very popular. James Houghton tries to start a vegetarian society. He's interested in vegetarian. I think he becomes a vegetarian during the famine. And one of his reasons is because that you would be able to feed more people and employ more people if you focused on tillage rather than on cattle, where it's a huge amount of it is export. And there's, of course, Bernard Shaw is a famous advocate of the vegetarian diet, but it doesn't really take off in Dublin. And I think part of that is just to do with wealth, having enough people that have the choice to make about what they eat. A lot of people are, as I suspect Patrick knows, are kind of de facto vegetarians because it's too expensive to get meat. But yeah, I mean, that does emerge. It's just not, it just doesn't have the same cachet like the DSPCA during the 19th century as it does in places in England, for example.
Roy Foster's book, Vivid Faces, which you doubtless know, this wonderful portrait of life in the city during this the Irish Revolution, has this lovely sketch of life in a vegetarian cafe, I think. So it does get there eventually, but
by the turn of the century, it's definitely more popular.
Christina Decker asks, what was your favorite animal that didn't make it into the book? Speaking on behalf of Major, my cat, I have to lament the absence of cats in the book.
Yes, cats would have been good. I think the one I most regret is chickens and hens, because that was a huge source of income. Going back to the issue of gender, that was a huge source of income for women, and that's something that I do a paper on that because I think it's definitely worth looking at.
Jennifer Redmond asks a very cheeky question. Did St. Patrick really get rid of all the snakes, or did you find evidence of any? It is answered in the comments by Nigel Monaghan from the National Museum, who says, with appropriate erudition, snakes have never been in Ireland, naturally, but the Natural History Museum has several examples of escaped pets, grass snakes, which is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, of course, they had pets they had snakes at various points in the zoo, as they do now. But otherwise, no evidence of snakes.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer. Catherine McCullough asks, my mother used to talk about seeing Buck Alec and his pet lion kept in his backyard in Belfast. Did anyone keep exotic animals at home in Dublin?
Well, famously, the Ball family, who were involved in both the Natural History Museum and the Zoological Gardens, they received the animals to their house before they went to the zoo. And so they often had, and yes, people kept, we know they kept fancy pets, particularly monkeys were particularly popular, and like parrots, various forms of parrots. We know they kept them because then they gave them to the zoo, presumably when they got a bit annoying to be having at home. Even things like raccoons, anything that people could get their hands on that seemed odd, they had a go at keeping it as a pet, and when they got sick of it, they sold it to the zoo or donated it to the zoo.
Excellent, thank you very much. Ruth McManus, thank you, Ruth, corrects me. She points out that the Lord Mayor's coach is much older, it's from the 1790s, and Nigel Monaghan adds that Daniel O'Connell's 1844 repeal carriage is in the National Museum collection and on loan for display at Derrynane at present. Nicholas Allen asks, do you think your book will also change how we read literature of the city and not just history?
Ooh, well, I hope one thing it will do is encourage people to read the sort of little sci-fi novella at the end that I talk about at the end, called Ballymuck Beg, which I feel is an overlooked piece of Irish literature, but I'm sure Nicholas can correct me if other people have seen it. I haven't seen much written about it. And it's called Ballymuck Beg, A Tale of 80 Years Hence. And it basically imagines what will happen if Ireland gets home rule, and Dublin will be divided in half, and the north side will be Dublin, the south side will be Ballymuck Beg and the town of the little pig, and we'll have Mud Island to the south of Dublin, and Ireland to the north. And I just think it's a great and hilarious tale. And there are lots of, I mean, I think the opportunity to look for what people have to say about animals in literature is still one that I think has not been fully exploited. So hopefully.
Well, I dare say this book will be mined by novelists for years to come, because it's full of wonderful little vignettes about animal life. We are approaching the end. We are way over time, in fact, but I think we might proceed for another 5 minutes or so, if you're happy enough to continue, yeah, Juliana. We'll try and get through these questions because they're excellent. Did you come upon any mention of rat catchers? And who, if so, who employed them?
Oh, yes. Not as often as you would think, because people don't associate rats with disease during the 19th century. So they're a nuisance, but they're not seen as spreading disease. So I didn't see a huge amount of that. It's really at the start of the 20th century when it's their association with plague and other diseases is understood, that they become a big focus.
Great. Adele Fitzpatrick asks, was there a bird market in Smithfield?
I don't know if it was in Smithfield. There was a bird market. I think
Yeah.
it's Patrick Street area is where I associate the bird market, like a fancy bird market. Yeah. Wow.
Liam comes back, says, thank you, Juliana. I was thinking of the Moore Street area in particular. Barry Kennert's book is very useful.
Yes.
The Public Health Commissions tell of some very insanitary sites.
Oh, yes, indeed.
I dare say they do. Hector asks, Juliana, would there be a particular animal that you think played a key role in civilizing 19th century Dublin, or that helped its advancement?
Oh, I'd say you just have to say the horse, because you know, all of transportation is dependent on the horse. Building houses is dependent on horses, hauling materials. Even the railways are dependent on horses to some degree. So the horse, yeah.
Katrina Bowman says, great to hear you will look again at chickens and hens, keeping women's income. Very good point. Incidentally, on that note, I was struck in
is it Bethel Solomons, who was the famous Jewish master of the Rotunda, man who played rugby for Ireland, featured in Finnegan's Wake, this extraordinary man. And his memoir I read some years ago, and I was very struck by the detail that he grew up on Waterloo Road, and every morning he went down the bottom of the garden to fetch the eggs for breakfast. And it just reminded me again, I suppose, I was reminded of it this week. I was thinking of our, there was a time when we lived in very close proximity to all sorts of animals, and I suppose how much the city has changed. But anyway, she asks, any evidence of rabbit keeping to sell the fur?
Oh, no, I didn't. But I mean, I can't say I was looking for that, but I didn't come across anything. It's an interesting question. But
Victoria asks, as the cattle trade is often associated with the rise of the Catholic middle classes in the 18th century, did you come across any examples of religious or folk religious festivals or traditions in relation to animals in the city?
Oh, no, but I'm not because they don't exist. I suppose because it wasn't my focus. The folk traditions around animals that I've come across often had to do with things about how to cure them or what to do if they were sick, rather than kind of more celebratory kind of things.
Okay. Colette Carroll points out there was a documentary called Fortune's Wheel about Bill Stevens, who kept a lion in Merino, and he is buried.
Well, there, I didn't know that, so that's one to look up. Excellent
trivia. Well done, Colette. Thank you.
Yeah.
Vincent Kenny asks, is Homo Dublinensis considered a rare breed?
Well, there's about 1 million of us, aren't there? So
we're not that rare. Claudia Kinmonth again comes back. When did humane societies start providing drinking troughs for animals and becoming concerned about cruelty? Might this be seen as a reflection of emerging civilization?
Yeah, so they certainly think so. And the troughs, the cattle troughs, which are still around the place in a few places, you can see them. I think there's some on the side of Stephen's Green. Those are kind of mid to late 19th century. They're a very common thing that 19th century humane societies do, because they're concerned with, essentially with cattle and horses traveling and not being able to get refreshment. And yeah, I mean, I think the humane societies saw themselves as promoting a form of civilization. I think the issue was around, the people who they targeted were largely poor people who worked with animals and depended on them, as opposed to people who were hunting, for example, and using animals for sport.
Okay, excellent. We are going to finish up in 2 minutes. See if we can finish these quickly. Please stop asking questions now. Time is up. Kathy asks, Juliana, did you come across any details about about waste, that waste from pigs may result in eye problems for horses? We're getting very obscure.
Oh God, no, that is an interesting question. No. What I mostly came across is that people don't like the way it smells, and that what they really don't like is when people have cattle and they keep pigs, because that's seen as particularly disgusting because you're producing milk and you've got the dirty pigs nearby, and how could this be in any way healthsome?
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Can we have some responses then as well? Katrina comes back just to say thank you very much. It is quite clear that our audience have hugely enjoyed your answers and indeed your descriptions of animal life in Victorian Dublin, and indeed that there's a huge appetite for reading this book. And I have to say it's been such a privilege to have you as our guest here this evening, Juliana, on Century Dublin 120 Dublin Stories. I dare say that the Little Museum of Dublin will be hosting some class of an exhibit around this subject in years to come, and we'd love to work with you on it. But in the meantime, we have to choose a winner.
Oh yes, and while you're doing that, Trevor, I'm going to just give the invitation if anyone wants to come for about 10 minutes to it's a separate Zoom meeting, just because this is not enabled to have people's pictures. If you want to come for 10 minutes with your animal, if you wish, or not, so I can just take a little photo. I'm going to put that up in the chat now and give people a chance to copy the link for themselves if they want. So just make sure. Yeah, so it's gone up there now. You just need the little part that says join Zoom meeting. So yeah, best question, Trevor.
I think, well,
we
it's,
can
I
call
just think
that
it's an intriguing one. Sinead Nick Andrews' question. She asked if you had to choose to be one animal from the book, what animal would it be and why? I thought it was an interesting. I thought that was particularly.
Okay.
Frankly, we could have chosen any of these questions. They were all so brainy and amusing. So well done to our audience. And the book, just to say one more time, the book is called Civilised by Beasts, Animals and Urban Change in 19th Century Dublin. It has been an immense pleasure to have you as our guest here, Juliana, this evening, and I wish you great success with the book. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Trevor. I really appreciate it. And yes, if anyone wants, I should plug the discount code. It is Beast50, BEASTS 50, and you get 50% off if you want to buy the book. If you were not Sinead, who gets a free book.
Excellent. Sinead, please get in touch with us in the museum. You can email me, trevor@littlemuseum.ie, with your address, and we will put it in the post to you tomorrow. To everybody else, thank you so much for joining us, and have a super evening. Okay, bye, Juliana.
Thank you.